That's good. I find it 8 minutes, like 49.
Thanks, man. Um, my thing, like the first time around, was just that everything I read, aside from my own launch, it was always with a group.
Yeah.
So I'd show up and I'm like, this should be fine, 5 minutes, whatever. And they're like, whoa, whoa.
We want more, Mike.
No, less. They'd be like,
Oh, 5.
about 2 minutes.
Okay.
About 2 minutes max.
Neil just did an event this weekend for Blue Met that was 6 writers reading for 15 minutes each.
15 each?
Yeah.
And people went and
Well,
stayed?
Neil was like, he was falling asleep on stage. Like,
I mean, this
sounds,
is the...
sounds not fun.
No, it doesn't. It just doesn't.
It's not why I go.
I think one thing...
Okay, I'm doing that.
just for a year.
Stop talking.
Yeah. I also, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, let's not talk about
Yeah.
our experience.
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody who's here live and everybody who's on live stream for our first live event post-COVID. So this is, yes. No mask because we're away from everybody. Saturday we'll be able to be maskless inside. Anyway, we're very happy to welcome both of you, Mike Steeves and
This guy?
Michael, who is going to ask the right question and Mike was going to give the right answers since it's going to be a conversation. So welcome for everybody who is watching online, and if you get a chance, come and visit us in Montreal, because that's where we are. So Sean, I'll let you introduce Mike, and sorry for the slips, I was thinking of something else.
Thank you, Ode. Hi everyone, it's so great to be here together in a room talking about books. My name's Sean Michaels, and I'm here to introduce Mike Steeves' new novel, Bystander, that is out now with Book Hug Press. Michael Steeves calls himself Mike on the covers of his books. Before I had ever met him, when I was reading about his first novel, Giving Up, this was what perplexed me most. Mike, not Michael. This isn't like Bill Bryson or Jackie Collins. Mike isn't the sort of nickname that displaces the original name. Michael's always still hanging there like a shadow. Mike is just the more casual form. Mike implies friendliness, helpfulness, short sleeves. What kind of author, I wonder, what kind of maniac would seek that the name on their novel convey friendliness, helpfulness, and short sleeves? So I read the book, Giving Up, which is a marvelous title by the Montreal author Mike Steeves. It came out in 2015, perhaps you've read it, it's wonderful. It's only 156 pages long. Giving Up comprises two stories, and both of them are bitterly biting portraits of ego, obsession, and the ways we fail ourselves. Its characters are hyper-aware of their thoughts and actions, yet in this skimming and unexamined way, they're neurotic, relatable fools. And the longer the book goes on, the more the reader thinks, wait, am I also a neurotic, relatable fool? Am I as much of a mess as this? It's the chilling and hilarious feeling that any reader gets when they recognize themselves in a novel. That sense of being seen, interpreted, and fully understood by a great writer. The feeling a bug must have when they're under the magnifying glass of a genius entomologist. But then you shrug it off and think, wait, who wrote this again? Mike Steeves? Good old Mike. And you lower your guard again. What I've learned now, after reading Giving Up, and then Steeves' brutal, hilarious, piercing second book, Bystander, after getting to know the author, after getting kicked out of Laurier Park together for drinking beers on the bleachers too late at night, is that the Mike in Mike Steeves is a kind of mask. It's a cover story, an alibi, that keeps the guard down, that lets the artist in. Mike is disarming. He's generous and good, and he wears short sleeves. But he's also discerning, incisive, and deeply observant. Bystander takes his first book's psychological obsessions and rotates them by 45 degrees. It's still a book about a fool like you and me, but it also reads as a book about society, or at least about the people who occupy most of the real estate. It's never a good idea to get involved, Bystander's narrator explains at the beginning. This is foreshadowing, and a warning, and just a great bit of comedic irony. But it's also a real dilemma revolving at the manuscript's heart. We shouldn't get involved with anything. We're fools and narcissists. We wreck and self-sabotage. And yet, we still should, shouldn't we? Can't we still care for each other in spite of everything? Please welcome Mike Steeves, who will read from his new book.
When I first started going on foreign assignments, I spent a lot of time reading guidebooks and Wikipedia articles on the history of the culture, history and culture of the places I traveled to. I would spend all of the time I had leading up to my departure researching the local cuisine, watching landmark films of the national cinema, and reading canonical works of the national literature. I would study the structure of the government and the major events of the country's history, and I did my best to grasp a few basics of the spoken and written languages. I told myself that all of this preparation would demonstrate to my would-be hosts the respect I had for their traditions and way of life. And I saw all the time I spent on this research as an investment in my future self. You're expanding your cultural awareness, I thought, and you're increasing your understanding of your own culture by gaining an appreciation of the way other people see the world and live their lives. I told myself this while I was preparing for my foreign assignments, even though I knew that deep down I didn't believe it. I wasn't curious about the people and cultures of the exotic locales I was sent to. Instead of curiosity, there was indifference. In place of admiration, there was good-natured condescension. Eventually, I had to admit to myself that I never had any interest in going to these places, and that I was only interested in being able to tell other people about the places I had been. You could say the whole point to learning so much about the countries where I went on my foreign assignments was so I didn't have to bother once I got there. I struggled to master the rudiments of the language so I would never have to actually learn it. I took the trouble of educating myself on the country's struggle for independence so I would be able to nod along to political and historical small talk without having to listen to what was being said. Whenever I found out where my company was sending me, I would feel so anxious at first over how little I knew about the place. And in many cases, I struggled to find the city on a world map. But after I read up a bit, the anxiety leveled off. And once I landed, it only took a couple of days before I was walking the streets as if I'd been there for years. While I thought I was learning about another culture, I was really just learning how to categorize cultures, I thought, as I lay on my couch looking at an email thread with a dozen of my colleagues that had been going on for days and had devolved into an exquisitely passive-aggressive exchange between two administrative coordinators. The yearning for knowledge I had when I was in my 20s, I thought, the hunger for life that consumed me, was simply the side effect of a paralyzing fear for the world I still hadn't figured out how to classify. And now that I seem to have lost that fear, now that I have satisfied my hunger for classification and given up on the yearning for knowledge thing, all sorts of other fears have flooded in to take its place. I used to spend all my free time immersed in a variety of interests and hobbies, I thought, but now I can hardly believe I ever took any of them seriously. For years, I used all of my vacation time to visit the greatest ski resorts in the world. I pushed myself to ski on the most difficult runs, to keep in excellent shape and develop my skills, but eventually I couldn't be bothered with the hassle of booking flights and schlepping my gear back and forth, spending most of the day shivering on a lift or crammed into a gondola, and paying extraordinary sums for coaching by former professional athletes, all so I could accomplish a level of ability that would only ever be considered above average at best. So I gave it up completely, and what had once been the animating force of my life was something I hardly ever thought about anymore. As I lay there in the same clothes I had worn to the office the day before, I thought about how I used to look down on anyone who let their passion for life go slack. People said it would happen to me too, that it was simply a product of getting older, and that it was actually a sign of wisdom and maturity to never get too excited about anything. When I was in my 20s, I vowed that I would never let this happen, that I would live a life of ambition, devotion, and curiosity, no matter how old I was. But now, I thought, I no longer think in terms of making something of myself or doing anything with my life, and my only goal is to keep everything as it is, without any interruptions to my routines. I used to be able to read a whole book without ever looking up from the page or losing the thread of the story, I thought. But now all I can manage is to hold a book in front of my face while I think about things I said at work. Instead of reading about the colonial history of the country I just lived in for 9 months, I watch lavishly produced historical foolishness on the TV every night. Instead of reading about 19th century feudalism or the great ideological shifts of the 20th century, I thought, I obsess over an awkward exchange I had with a colleague while we were waiting for the elevator, or I consider my response to an HR memo regarding the new guidelines for vacation requests. All the energy I used to devote to cultivating an appreciation of classical music is now being used for arguments with customer service representatives. Even though I see myself as a cultural person with a wide variety of tastes in literature, music, and film, it has been years since I finished a book or gone to a concert. All that remains of my intellectual curiosity is a voracious appetite for prestige TV. And the hours I might have once spent going to museums and concerts are now spent on my social media accounts. Which is all to say that I was a very different person from when I first moved into my apartment, or from a couple years later, when I'd taken the position that would end up sending me on foreign assignments all over the world. I can't say when exactly I started to lose interest in having a cultural life. It wasn't like I realized all of a sudden that everything that used to sustain me and move me didn't do anything for me anymore. In fact, for a long time after I stopped getting anything out of my established routines, I kept buying books and going to museums and vacationing at the most famous ski resorts in the world. But eventually I stopped buying books when I realized I was never reading them. And when I went to a new exhibition at our city's world-class Museum of Modern Art, I couldn't even be bothered to go through every room. And instead I went to the cafe and looked at the internet on my phone. When I went on one of my ski trips, I would call it a day after a couple of runs. And some days I didn't go out at all. Throughout the years that I was reading books, going to museums, and skiing at famous ski resorts, I believed that one day, in the not-so-distant future, everything I was doing would lead to something greater. I had no idea what that would be exactly, but greatness of some kind, material or spiritual, I really didn't care. After a few years went by and nothing great happened, I told myself that it didn't matter as long as I liked to read and go to museums and ski. And it wasn't too long after this that I stopped doing all three. There was never going to be any click, I thought. No moment of clarity. No, this is what it's all about, or this is what I was meant to do. Of course, I had always known my life had no purpose, but now I actually felt it. I could feel the purposelessness of my life in everything I did, from the simple act of opening the fridge to staring at a masterpiece on the walls of a gallery. I would like to believe that this diminishment, this thinning out that took place in every aspect of my life, wasn't simply a consequence of getting older. I'd like to believe that I was so depressed by the daily catastrophes in the news that I found it hard to concentrate on anything else, or that I became so frustrated at work that I simply told myself a comment I had made about an old in a chat guitar again. I used to bring with me on all my foreign assignments, then I might recover a bit of that feeling that I was heading towards something. Thanks.
I feel listening to you, but also reading the book, this constant barrage of the thought, like, what a jackass, and also same. Like, and I was wondering, one of the things that always strikes me, because I feel like I'm a very different sort of writer in some ways, is like, how do you keep track? Like, you have one like deep incisive observation about the way you think, or this character thinks, or we all think, after another, after another, after another. And I wonder, do you just sit there in like this reverie of having these thoughts, or do you are you able to sort of note thoughts you have over the course of your days and kind of squirrel them away?
Yeah, I don't know. So I worried about that because I don't plot these things out. I don't say like chapter 1, he's going to rob the bank, chapter 2, he gets caught, or what have you. So I am concerned, or I was aware about the risk of repetition. And there is like recursiveness in the book, like certain things, like prestige, TV keeps on coming up. That's not necessarily like a thought, it's just something that he's doing. And so I don't keep track of them, and I probably use the editing process as a way of like removing stuff that is repetitive or that keeps on cropping up in a way that isn't clever, but that is actually obviously just me forgetting what I had written 50 pages before. But I think probably also there's just like I don't know how to say it, like there's like modes, right? So it's like the first part is like returning from this foreign assignment mode, and he's not really interacting with anybody in his neighborhood. And so he's going to have like work thoughts, and like I'm also just laying the groundwork for what's coming. So you're getting sort of like who I am, like this particular asshole. And then, because when I was looking for a part to read for this thing, when it gets into this stuff later on, it's like when he's out in the world in the second part, and he's interacting with folks and that sort of thing, you start getting different styles of kind of ruminations, but that's a long way of me saying I don't know how I organize that, but it was something with both books that I thought about, because I'm like, why don't I just, when every day that I write, why don't I just keep on writing the same thing? How do I move this forward? And I just feel it, Sean.
Maybe we should, I should say, I'm going to talk to Mike for a while, and then I'm going to, hopefully, I'd love to open the floor to any questions you have. And, if you have questions, it can be really exciting to hear them, because they're more interesting often than the things I've ruminated on. So as we talk, if Mike says anything that you'd like to hear more about, kind of really try to notice that question in your head and store it away for a bit later.
Yeah.
And because we'd love to hear it. Why don't we start? I thought we could, let's talk about that initial, what's it called? The inciting incident.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
The bystander begins with a sort of tragedy or big event that sends its relatively complacent narrator into a tailspin.
Yeah.
And I was hoping we could start by talking about that event. I think the spoiler's okay.
Yeah, that's
and,
fine.
And about what sparked that in you.
So it was like it was an actual thing that had happened to somebody that I was close with. Like the event, just whatever, spoiler alert, is this guy comes back, he's been away for 9 months on a foreign assignment, or what he calls a foreign assignment, like he's working for fancy business sort of thing. And he, when he returns home to this apartment that he's been living in since he was in his since his college days, he meets this new individual who's moved in to the apartment next to him, and meets him very briefly, and then never meets him again. Weeks go by, and he notices a funny smell in his apartment, and then ultimately the discovery at the end of the first part of this book is that this man is dead. His new neighbor that he only met once is dead. And so that happened to someone that I am close with, and I was aware that it was happening when it was happening, and I'm being somewhat coy. But anyway, the point is just that this was an anecdote. It's Nikki. She's in the audience. So anyway, this thing happened, and I was aware that it happened. It just troubled me for years. What troubled me about it was that, well, there was a bunch of things that troubled me about it. I don't even know where to begin. I wrote a whole book because it was like, what this really bothers me. But the initial thing I would say that troubled me about it was both that someone could be 2 feet away,
and on the other side of a wall.
Literally on the other side of a wall, and that they are there for weeks and nobody notices. So probably a little troubled by that I had at the time to this thing, like, and wondered about that, you know, because it's like, what could you do? But also it feels like you should do something, you know? So it felt like a real problem. And something that I think is probably, I don't know, part of living in a big city and close to people and this sort of thing. And there's this weird thing that happens where you're both proximate to people and also not at all. And after it happened, I was like, oh, this terrible thing happened. And then, of course, it's like anything. Like, once you see something, you see it everywhere. So after that took place, I would hear these stories from someone, you know, people I know all the time, be like, oh, yeah, that happened there. And I'd be like, oh, goodness. And it was a similar sort of thing every time, just people sort of dying and like not, like nobody knowing about it for a period of time, usually in apartment buildings. And I just found that enormously disturbing. Yeah, so that was the inciting incident. And I guess I should be, I can elaborate and just say, like, so it wasn't me that actually, like, the events that are narrated in the book that have to do with Peter Simon's experience of that event were not my experiences. They were that of my wife, Nikki.
I'm not Peter Simon's history. I'm not like that guy.
She's not like that guy.
No, she's not.
No.
I know her. I can vouch. I think we've talked about this a lot, but there's like something distinctly bizarre as a writer, and maybe even particularly as a novelist, just because novels take a long time.
Yeah.
That, you know, this is an incident that can happen in someone's life, maybe Nikki's, and sort of pass, you know, it's one moment, and then you can overhear this, and then it becomes like this kernel of, you know, your life's work for 5 years.
Yeah.
Does it feel like, what is it like to hear something that happens to someone else and kind of become devoted to it?
Yeah, like I didn't decide right away, like as soon as this thing happened, that I'm like, oh, I'm going to write about this or anything like that. It was over time, like I had worked on that other book that I published, Giving Up, and I finished that, like, you know, after that incident had taken place. And I think just as the years went by and I just kind of kept coming back to this thing, initially I decided, I'm like, I'll write a short story. Because it felt like it was a short story. It felt like it was not a 200 and however many page novel. It felt like it was just an isolated, discrete incident that I could kind of like get the things down that I wanted to get down. And then sure enough, as soon as I started writing it in the style that I write in, I was like 30 pages in. I'm like, it's going to take a while. And I was reading, so there's this really good septology. It's actually a trilogy, but he calls it, this Norwegian writer, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm going to say John Foss, but it could be Jan Foss, or I don't know what it is, but...
Do you have any other ideas of how it might be pronounced?
Well, there's Bob Fosse, and he spells his last name the same way, so I'm like, is it Jan Fosse? Mm-hmm. But anyway, he wrote this beautiful book. Last volumes were published this year, and in it there's a painter who talks about his motivation for painting is that he's trying to get the images that are in his head out of his head, and that there's this expiation that takes place when he's got something in here that he ultimately puts on a canvas. And that thing is the closest kind of way of describing it that I've ever encountered. This notion of it's like here, and there's this desire to kind of like somehow do a kind of transference so that it's out in the world and so that you can be rid of it, you know? Because yeah, there is an element of like, I can't be rid of this until I've organized it. And this is how I organized it.
One of the things I think makes the book so strong and so interesting is that a couple of, you turn the page and you go over to the dark side of the moon. It's not that suddenly we change settings, but whereas I feel like the first part of the book is about reckoning with like something happened on the other side of the wall, and the narrator kind of didn't do enough, or did he?
Yeah.
And then the second part is about an incident with neighbors, or an ongoing incident with neighbors, where in fact the narrator kind of does instead of doing not enough, he does way too much.
Yeah.
And so is that something like, is that kind of, so you've got a theme that's explained, like I think about Bach, but like, you've got a theme that's explored in the first part of the book, and then there's a real variation or inversion of that theme in the second part as it goes. It still explores that bystanderness, that like taking action, inaction, all this stuff, but from a completely kind of different way. So is that like still part of flushing that initial thought from your brain?
Yes. Yeah, and I did it with the last one too, with Giving Up.
Yeah.
Like, I remember when I was working on Giving Up, the first section is just this one voice and says a bunch of things. And when I got to the end of that, like initially I thought that was going to be it. And then when I got to the end of it, I'm like, this is unbalanced. You need to like now, sort of even it out. So as you say in that first part, it's like, oh, I didn't do enough. Then there's this kind of middle part where basically kind of drunkenly comes to that sort of realization to a certain extent. And in the third part, I think he has a sort of like, I'm going to turn over a new leaf in some way, although like nobody should fall under any illusions that any new leaves were going to be turned over. And so he's kind of the only one that's fooled into thinking that. And that, was consciously, as the book like very, very emphatically notes, is actually the plot to Conrad's Lord Jim, where in the first part, the Lord Jim character is on this merchant marine ship and believes it's sinking, and he abandons ship and he doesn't save any of the people that are on the ship. And then he's so ashamed of what happened, basically because he had always seen himself as a big hero. He had always thought that he was going to do these great heroic things, and because like nobody else who abandoned the ship had any problems with what they were doing, because they didn't have that dissonance, right? Like everybody else was like, we should get out of here. But like Jim was like, but what about all the people we should save? And the unscrupulous folks that he's with are like, we're going. And so he feels bad about that in the second part of the book, he goes to Borneo. It's not called Borneo in the book, I forget what it's called, but he tries to like redeem himself by like taking up with like, people that are living there and the tribes or the kingdom that's living there, and like serve as some sort of savior. And he gets shot in the head or chest, I can't remember where, but like doesn't go well, and so like I don't know what I'm saying when I do that. It just seemed like the right trajectory.
But I think it is like, I feel like a lot of certain kind of art making or writing is really like, it's all about finding that second gear.
Yep.
It's like, strawberries are delicious, but if you ate a huge amount of strawberries, you wouldn't say like that was a great meal,
Right.
And so you again ought to figure out, okay, what do we put with the strawberries? Champagne, or something really another piece.
And then there's always that risk then, right? That people are like, I really like the first
Yeah,
part, but not the second part, and that sort of thing. So you're right. Like on the one hand, you're like, it can't just all be this one thing. But then you run the risk of people saying like, I had way more affection for that initial thing than what subsequently followed. And I find that it's usually in the second part, because that's where you kind of have to like reckon with what you've laid out in the first part. And people might not always be like, I thought he was gonna get married at the end.
Go to Disneyland.
Yeah, exactly. And no shade on books that end that way, or plenty of shade. But yeah, so people might wind up hoping for certain things to take place that don't, or expecting certain themes to come up that you don't address, or something like that.
Lord Jim is also the site of a major traumatic event in my education.
Oh.
Yeah.
we
Shout out
talked
to
about that?
McGill Bachelor Department of English. I remember, we read Lord Jim is Professor Alan Hepburn here? Hopefully not.
No, he's not in the audience tonight.
Or he's probably on the live stream. Professor Hepburn was a good teacher. But there was we were reading Lord Jim, which I loathed.
Yeah.
This is a much better book than the works of Joseph Conrad. And I remember he had some question. I don't remember if it was rhetorical. It seemed like a rhetorical. He had a question for the class about Lord Jim, about the themes or something, and no one was and he was just berating us, demanding an answer to his question, and finally I was the fool who offered an answer, and then he like excoriated. He was just like, "What an idiotic
See, how
response."
do you do that? How do you do that?
And it was one of the it was the only moment I think of like public humiliation in my university time.
Yeah, that sounds okay. That sounds awful. I mean,
Brought up a lot of bad feelings.
I'm glad you named him, though.
Yeah. Wherever he is, don't do that to students.
No,
don't. Okay, Peter. So Peter is a straight cis white man,
yes,
as I am and as you are.
Mm-hmm.
But he feels, reading this book, I felt like he was even more generic than just like a person like you or I who is a unique human being in spite of his commonplace features. He seemed almost like at certain times this kind of doughy manifestation of white supremacy or the patriarchy. And I wondered if you could talk about like that decision to make him even more, like he is very individual and has, specific thoughts. Yeah. But there is like this deliberate formal stylistic genericism. You let him be like a stand-in for a certain kind of person in a way that some writers would like be pushing back. Often the work is like, how do I individuate this person? I don't want to represent a stereotype. I don't want to represent an archetype. And I feel like in a weird way at times you kind of like
ran towards them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually thought about this one beforehand because I'm like, Sean will probably ask some kind of version of this question. And I just finished doing like a interview with my publisher that posed a similar sort of thing. She said like, oh, he's an overthinker. Like he really thinks a lot, but he's also underthinking constantly. So I was thinking about this one last night. I'm like, why did I do that? What was that about? And it's kind of like if you were being less generous, you could pose the question is like, why is this guy such an unremitting, like why is he so unpleasant? Like why is he thinking in sort of these, as you say, like just these kind of like very generic kind of stereotypical ways about everything? I probably don't know why exactly I had the instinct to make him that way. But I thought about it after a while, like, because in the book, like, there's only a couple people that are even named, right? So he's named, his boss is called Roger, and virtually everybody else is just given this name that he identifies with whatever they do. So there's the super, the handyman, athleisure wear woman, like the list goes on. The Grim Reaper is not actually Death, but just he gives her that name. And so everyone has this kind of like stereotyped, surface only, just like presentation, so to speak. And as you say, like he always, or seems to always be kind of thinking of people and himself in those terms. I don't know. Like, because on the one hand, when I answered that question that my publisher asked, I was like, so stereotypes are weird, right? Because they're all false, they don't fit, and yet you use them constantly. You kind of need them. They're often shorthand, right? So it's like, I don't know about this place, like I hear Japan, they like, the food's good, or like, I don't know, Canadians are polite, and it's like entirely false. It's a way of kind of forcing something that is unique or particular into this thing. And so, I just needed to talk long enough, Sean. And so it's probably a matter of that I think in the world that this guy lives in, which is the world that I live in, you're probably having those ways of seeing the world always forced on you. It's probably a challenge to see things with all their uniqueness and their specificity and their particularity. Like the world doesn't really want you to see things that way anymore. Thank you. Holy shit. There it is.
Yeah.
That's the answer, everyone. Yeah, that must be it.
I mean, the effect is sort of this weird, there is a bit of this weird effect where there are moments where the book feels sort of like an allegory in that the main character feels allegorical, like a representative of, what's wrong with the way certain people, dominant culture thinks.
This guy.
That guy.
Briefcase, who even carries briefcases anymore, right? But you see that and you're just like, jerk. And then he's holding his cell phone to his ear. Nobody does that. They either like do this, they hold it out like this, or they've got like a thing here. But we know that he's a jerk because he's holding it to his ear like that, like jerks do. And so yeah, it's like.
But whereas the other characters in the book don't feel like they're these reduction. They feel like they're unknowable but whole.
What I again, like, I would be lying if it was like I meant for this to happen. But what I noticed afterward was that the other characters in the book, as you say, like, feel like if you could just like move him out of the way, if you could just like take his screen he puts over everything, you might see these people.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, he's in the way. And so like they wind up being characters that like they're defined by like the negative space. Like everything that he says about them, you then are really like, I probably gather what they are based upon like what's being filled out beyond that. So yeah, whereas he unfortunately like doesn't have much left, there's not much left in him that like could be said like to be his own.
Distinguishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how he wound up like that. We don't get his backstory.
That's right.
Yeah.
What happened to him?
What
A breakup.
Yeah, it's a breakup.
But at the same time, or not at the, but okay. For me also, this book really felt like a kind of lament, actually.
Okay.
Like there was this note of kind of like amused sorrow that I put in, I have a blurb on.
Yeah.
But we're also regretful, kind of sad way. So there's this note of sorrow to why are we like this, and of self-implication.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't feel like you're trying to be like, oh, those other people who are like this.
Yeah.
It's very much like you feel the writer is knowing of this, and that sadness I think is part of what gives the book its humanity, and that it saves it from being such a deeply cynical book, because there's this note of sorrow. It's like, it's not just this is the way it is, fuck everything. It's this is the way it is, and that's a disappointment, something in some way. Was it important to you that the book not slip into a sort of nihilism?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So one of the other models for the book is Notes from the Underground, and that book, I think, the first time around I read it, I didn't get it. And I think that's true of like maybe a lot of folks that read that book.
Who wrote that book?
I can't remember. Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Mm-hmm.
So that book, it's like Raskolnikov. It's not Raskolnikov. He's not even given a name. It's just Underground Man. And he's like kind of an unpleasant dude. He really there's a huge section where he gets like upset because like some officer, Nevsky Prospect, is like shouldering him as he walks past and not acknowledging his existence, and Underground Man gets like really upset over that. There's a bunch of things that happen in the book, and I just read the book, and it's like, Underground Man, he's not a very pleasant person, and you might not have noticed that Dostoevsky was basically mounting a critique of Western liberalism. And he never explicitly says it in the book, but his anecdote for that would be Russian Orthodox sort of Christianity. Not sort of, just Russian Orthodox Christianity. And so I think it's fair to say that most people that read Dostoevsky's books now don't like get to the end of Crime and Punishment and be like, well, all I have to do is now embrace the Russian Orthodox Christ and like, that's it for me. But the critique still works, and you can feel that he is implying like there is, something on the other side of this, or there's a way out of this, or we're not necessarily fated to this. And if you asked him, you're like, okay, so how do we get out of it? And he's like, well, just embrace the Russian Orthodox Christ. And I'm like, see, I'm not going to do that, but I'm assuming there might be some other way. I just don't know what it is. So it was important to me, but like far be it from me to advocate, you know, any sort of like, we should all like become fundamentalists in one way or another. But it would be disingenuous of me to say that I didn't, you know, because I recounted the anecdote earlier that led to writing this book, that I didn't think that, you know, there was a problem. There is kind of a problem to a certain extent in the way that at least I, you know, organize. I just realized my hand on the mic the whole time. The way I organize kind of my life in the world and in the neighborhoods and the communities that I live in and that sort of thing. And I think, you know, you should never become like so, and I do it all the time, but like that thing, right, where you just like someone's in need and you walk by, because it's like, because you can't really get involved in every little thing, and it's not practical, and it might even be dangerous, right? You're like, oh, I'll help him, and he's like, ah, and you're like, ah, that was a mistake. But it hurts, right? It hurts by that stuff, and it hurts to not do that and to know that somehow we live in a world where it's like, I think the neighbor's dead, and be like, yeah, let's just leave it to the super though, right? Like this, don't get involved. This is the whole thing. We're gonna miss the movie if you report it, you know. And so, just this, you know, it's cold a little bit, right? But to say that out loud, like I don't say this explicitly in the book, because like people are like, well, what are you gonna do about it? Like, nothing at all. like even when people, you know, there's one friend of mine who read the book and he got back to me and he was like, man, this book really got to me, and like I feel like I should be a better person at work, and I should stop like, you know, like reading so many long form articles, or I should be nicer to my family. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm not doing anything different as a result of writing this. Like, but yeah, you know.
We're in the golden age of TV. Why would you, stop. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like the anecdote you told me about your publisher. After you turned in the book, you did have a phone call with one of the publishers where he was like, this isn't, like, you're not a fan, like, this isn't like a book by an angry man who's being like, this is what a tough life we have. Like, the critique was there. But to me, it's pretty clear. You had this great line about, in that interview you mentioned with Book Hug, where you said that what Peter wants to do is to live a frictionless existence, which means one without much contact with other people, since other people invariably cause friction. Other people, by this logic of the good life, are reduced to nuisances and obstacles. And I thought that's a really interesting way of kind of like making a weak, like a strong, like a timidly strong case for like the role of that friction in the world. Like if it senses like all these awkward, uncomfortable, getting dragged into things are sorts of like, those are experiences that maybe we need to try to make sure are still part of our life or even seek out.
Listen, I was listening to the CBC a couple weeks ago, and there was a show on it, and folks were talking about like basically the point to this show was like people were calling in and talking about like how they basically cut off friends who were like taking up too much time, you know. And don't get me wrong, like, you know, you gotta have boundaries, you gotta have limits, all the whatever the words that we use now to say these things. But I was just like, am I hearing this correctly? Like, and what was bizarre is that it was like a good thing, right? Like they were all like, good. And it was like, yeah, you know, she was just calling all the time, and it was like, you know, like affecting my ability to do the things that mattered to me. And so I just told her, like, until you're more fun, like, never call me again. And, you know, the radio host would be like, you got to do that, you know. And they were like, I know. I apologize to, you know, I'm sure these people are awful and they deserve to be cut off.
Please interview Mike about the book on the radio waves.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, like this So yeah, the thing that you said about the frictionless thing, it's like, I feel like the culture actually kind of tells us this, right? It's like, you know, your job difficult, quit it. Like your friends like want you to do things, fuck them. You know, like get new ones. You know, like they're not like helping you. Like you know, be all your whatever, all the amazing things that you need to realize in yourself. And like Ode referred to Catholic school, and like I did go, and like so I did the Catholic thing until I was 18, and I took like a philosophy class and like wait. But up until that point, like I liked the message sometimes, and the message was just like it's a little more Dostoevskian, it's a little more like suffer for other people, you know, and like think of yourself at your peril, you know. If you're like thinking myself for a second, like the hellfire for you, you're like I could use a new shirt and like burn eternally. Like I'll give it to someone else. And be like you're okay then. So like. I'm not saying, because like I think there's a history to Catholicism. I think there was some bad things.
Yeah, they've done. I've heard
bad things. I don't know. So like a balance between like cutting off all your friends who are like, "Can you help me move?" and like
moving is a very good example. Like that's. I feel like anyone at a certain moment in their life, it's like someone can help you move. Ooh, you're in like a moral dilemma.
Like, maybe this is
you know.
Maybe this is it. Like maybe we never talk again, you know. So yeah, like I feel like in this book, the main character, and I mentioned this in that interview, is I'm like he's actually kind of doing the right thing. He's kind of doing what all of the messages are telling him to do, which is like live for yourself, maximize your happiness, and if anything is kind of getting in the way of that, like do away with it. It leads to a place where he's like nobody, you know? And it actually reminds me of, and I'll stop after this, but like in American Pastoral, the Philip Roth book, there's a character in it who becomes like, I guess there's like a religious practice, it's called like Jainism or something, Jainism. So like you don't harm creatures,
right?
You
don't step on bugs.
Yeah, you don't step on bugs and this sort of thing. In the book, the character, she interprets it like very, like to the extreme, and she's like, bacteria are living, so she won't wash, like it has terrible consequences for her, because she realizes like everything is living. And so just to be alive is a violation of all of this stuff. And so he kind of takes the frictionless thing a little too far. It's kind of like that.
It's an interesting thought to have in like this kind of extended pandemic, endemic, post-intense, at least in terms of the lockdowns and stuff, moment where obviously a lot of us were forced to or privileged enough to, like, I don't know how to really, forced to lead these kind of closed up, like life became more frictionless when you weren't leaving your house, when you didn't, and I think so many of us noticed that when we weren't seeing or talking to those people that are just like a couple levels removed from normal life, you know, the people we see out in the city, the friends and acquaintances that we would run into at book events, that actually like without the all those burrs that you pick up, all that like in normal life, that you felt poor, you know, poorer for it. And it's interesting to kind of be I think everyone's kind of confronted with that now.
Big time. Big time. Yeah.
I wanted to open up to the floor to if any of you have, I would love if any of you have any thoughts or questions to bring up. Actually, but especially questions rather than thoughts.
You've got a connection?
I have a few notes. You sort of ended up talking, we don't have to talk this whole time about Catholicism, but the character's name is Peter Simon.
Oh, right.
And in the New Testament, Simon Peter, denies knowing Christ, and that's a really effective story. If anyone's ever read it, either in a religious way or just a literary way. And how does that tie in with your guy?
Thank you. Yes, I don't mention that in.
I didn't pick up. I'm Jewish. I didn't.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a story, Sean. Yes. So thank you. That is correct. Like that was one of the other big models for this book is that story in So in all of the Testaments, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the story is very straightforward. It's basically Christ, right before he's being crucified, says to Simon Peter, who of course is the father of the Catholic Church, he says, like, by the way, they're going to crucify me, and you are going to deny that you knew me when they're doing it. And Simon Peter's like, no way. And Christ is like, big time. And so sure enough, like, it's the Bible, so things move real quickly. People come into the garden and they take Christ, and then they go off to crucify him. And Simon, I forget now who it is. Simon Peter follows along, and to see what's going to happen. And when he's doing that, yeah, people say to him, like, you knew Christ, and he denies it. And that, to kind of flash back to a question that Sean asked about, like, when things stay with you. So that's probably one of the first stories that, like, profoundly disturbed me, because, you know, Simon Peter's like, he's his buddy. He's like his best friend, and he's told he's going to do it, and so, like, he's well armed, right? Like, you're going to do this, and he's like, well, like, if someone tells you, like, don't step on the dog poop, you're like, I won't. You know, it's like, why did you do that? So it was very disturbing to me, that story, and in particular the moment where he denies that he knows this individual who is being crucified, just felt like almost, this is hilarious, sounded worse than the crucifixion itself, you know. I don't know why. It was like this specific form of abandonment that I just, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, ooh. And so when I was working on this book, it just came to me initially as I'm like, that's kind of what this guy is doing. And he does it in the second part. And it's, you know, like, I don't want to draw some sort of straight kind of connection and be like, the neighbor is Christ and he is Peter Simon's, you know, not Simon Peter, but he is doing that thing where he is saying, he literally in Matthew, he says, like, I know not what thou sayest, you know, not just like, I don't know who this is, but I don't even know what you're talking about. Like a complete denial, not just of the person, but of the conditions of their relationship, of everything.
And it was something that he thought he wouldn't do.
Correct.
Just like this character.
Correct. It's something that in advance of doing it, he told himself, I would never do it. It's like literally Christ is like, you're going to do this. He's like, never. Like, you know this guy? He's like, never met him. And it's like, it happened. And in one of the stories, I think it's Luke, it's awful, because when he does it, Christ somehow is like, and then Christ looks at him. You know, so he says, like, I know him, and then the cock crows, and then, like, Luke is like, and then Christ looked at him, and they're like, oh, God, it's awful. It's so awful. And then a few years ago, I read this book, well, I didn't read the book. Heather knows that I didn't read the whole book. It's Eric Auerbach, Mimesis. So I read the part that was on this, and he points out that story in the Bible, he's like, this is kind of one of the first moments in literature, so to speak, or literary culture, whatever you want to call it. Like, previous to this, all these myths are like just, you know, gods, half-gods, demigods, like warriors, heroes, kings, stabbing, killing each other, betraying each other, all that sort of stuff, Odyssey and on up. And then in the Bible, it's just some guy, just a totally normal guy. It's like the first kind of prosaic sort of stories, not the first. Someone's going to be like, not actually the first, but, you know, one of. And it's this new hero, and he's not a hero at all. But it's kind of like, well, why are you telling us this? It's in all four Gospels. Why are you? And especially, it's like, this is the father of the church. So everybody's reading it is like literally in church, and like, he's the best, the first pope. And they're like, what did he do? Like, well, he betrayed Christ. Like,
Yeah, but he felt guilty after
he felt guilty afterwards. Yes, and I guess that's the important part, right? Is that he wasn't like, I'm going home.
Yeah.
You know. So yeah, and it's the sound of the cock crowing that like signifies his guilt.
Does Peter Simon feel guilt?
Yes.
Yeah, big time. And so like even in the part that I read, this is the thing like. Even in the part that I read, like throughout, you know, in the book, he's always saying, "I thought." Like he is pointing out that like this all happened before, and like he feels definitely guilt, but like it's also not clear at the end. Like, so guilt is fine, but like it's not necessarily the most productive emotion, you know. So he feels guilt, but then he also, spoiler, he kind of shrugs it off. He said the last line is something to the effect of like, I'm sure this sort of thing happens all the time. Based on my research, it does.
I think we'll actually just put it down there. If you have questions, I'm sure Mike would love to talk it over. You can pick up a book here. He can autograph it for you and write a personalized message to you or a loved one. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. Merci beaucoup. My pleasure. Congratulations. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you. And scene.
We're clear.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
You
Great job.
You thought a lot about this. Thank you. Thank you. Hi. Oh, you gonna put one up? Oh wow. I'm gonna get my fancy pen. Thank you so much for coming.
Just a minute, just like 10 seconds.
These haven't been on the whole time, have they, Liz? Oh, God. I'm saying terrible things. Okay.
All right. We just wanted to say goodbye to all of you online, and we're going to stay with the live people
Thank you so much for tuning in.
and buy the book.
Thank you. Hello.
How do you feel about making this out to me and Jason?
I feel totally great about
Sorry
that.
you can't be here.
That's fine. I can't believe you made it. So Lori with an I, yes.
Lori with an I and an E.
Holy shit.
I know,